Hi, geography students. We are nearing the end of Unit 2 now. We're taking a look at today applying what we've learned about migration and taking a look at a particular case study. And today it's going to be one close to home, and that's the United States. So let's take a look and see if we can apply some of the things that we learned about migration in general and see if we can understand the migration waves of the United States a little bit better. All right, so the way that historians typically look at immigration in the United States is they look at it in several waves. All right, similar to your migration groups that you're studying, the United States had waves of migration, a period of time where there was a large influx of people. And so we break that down into different time periods. The first time period we're going to talk about is the Colonial Era, or the first wave of migration. This is the time period where the United States, wasn't even the United States yet. They were, colonies of England. And so during that time period is the first time we see immigrants move into the area later known as the United States. This first wave was characterized by mostly Europeans coming over for different reasons, but mainly from England, Ireland, France, Scotland, and Germany. As you can see there, about 500,000 Europeans came during this time period. And what they typically came for, number one, was a chance to make money. They saw this as a new opportunity for more land and to make money in these new colonies. And we know that's the number one reason why people migrate, is for jobs and economic reasons. Other reasons why people came was to seek religious freedom. So we know that cultural factors or social factors are another big reason why, and that was one that Europeans came to the United States for, was to get away from the persecution that was going on in England and the other places they were coming from during this time period, and they could worship their own religion in the way that they saw fit. Between that and how the government controlled their lives, they saw this as a land of freedom and opportunity and a way to make money as well. So we can see all of that in our first wave of migration. The other big group that came during this time period was closely associated with it was Africans from typically West Africa, and this was through the Atlantic slave trade. We know this was part of our history, and they were brought in as a labor force in order to make money for these large-scale agricultural endeavors that they were making money on in the colonies. And so about 50,000 Africans were brought in from West Africa during this time period, and those were characterized as our first big wave of migration, so before our Revolutionary War. The second wave of migration was in the early 19th century to the mid-19th century. So as you can see there, it's 1820 to 1870 is the time period we generally give to it. And this is characterized by another large-scale wave of migration, and it's mostly Irish and Germans. And the main reason why that you have a large Irish population especially is because of something going on there, a big push factor in the potato famine. This was a time period in which their crop in Ireland that they relied on heavily for many of the poor areas of Ireland was the potato. And after that potato famine occurred, where a large amount of the crop was destroyed, there was a large spread sense of unease around Ireland as to its future. And so at the same time period, America was growing very quickly. They had a lot of new opportunities for jobs and a very large country that was looking to expand. One of the ways that was looking to expand was through the railroad system. One of the major projects at the time was to build a transcontinental railroad, basically from the East Coast to the West Coast. And they needed a large workforce for this as well. And as you know, or may not know, during that time period, they did have some slave labor involved, but most of the labor actually came from poor Irish and poor Chinese immigrants coming into the country looking for work. So again, economics, another reason why people are immigrating to the United States. And they were many times very poorly paid, but it was better than the lives that they had elsewhere. And so, couple this along with a big gold rush, and that ended up causing a lot of people to want to move to the United States. Several pull factors here. Um, and we also see a large amount of Chinese guest workers because of this railroad, because of the gold rush. They needed, people to work there, especially, in the areas of the country that slavery was not permitted. And so the Chinese were a logical option. Therefore, they could pay them very little. And so we did have a few Chinese immigrate there, but a lot of them were just guest workers, and many returned home after the railroad was complete. All right. Moving on, we have our third wave of migration. This was one of the largest, and it was the largest to this point. And this was in the late 19th to early 20th century. So basically the turn of the century there before, we see the large-scale modern time period. And that's 1881 to 1920. And this is a time period where mostly it's going to be Europeans immigrating. And this is not now Western Europeans like England or France or Ireland anymore. It's going to be from Eastern Europe. Okay, so we have a lot of Eastern Europeans as well as Southern Europeans, specifically Italians were a large majority of this population. So Italians, Eastern Europeans, such as Romania and Ukraine and Croatia, some of these other countries like that today, those areas, as well as Russia. So a lot of countries are seeing a mass exodus in Europe and see the United States as this growing power, a lot of a land of economic opportunities that they were not getting in their home countries. And so again, we see that that number one factor, economics, play a part here. We also see a large Jewish immigration during this time period because of their persecution around Europe. So some of you are studying the Jewish migration. That's one of the places they immigrated to was the United States, and this is where we get a large portion of our Jewish population today. 23 million Europeans, that's a lot, and most of them are immigrating to cities. As you know, that's a common factor in migration. They're moving to big cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston and ones that are popping up out west as well. And this is when we first start seeing quotas being instituted. Okay, so what a quota is a set amount that they will allow per year for the number of immigrants. And so we're going to see, restrictions on how many people can immigrate because the United States has such a great pull factor during this time period. They realize we're growing too quickly, and people start to become worried that we have too many immigrants. And it's going to change our culture. And so they institute these quotas to reduce the amount of those populations. All right, so that's the third wave of migration. Again, Southern Europe, such as Italy, and also Eastern Europe, as well as specifically Russia as well. Our final wave, our fourth wave of migration, is going to be roughly the last century, so late 20th up until today, so 1965 to present. The main place that we're seeing immigrants come into the country from are Asian countries, specifically Southeast and East Asian countries like Vietnam, Thailand. We're seeing a lot of people from the Philippines, China, and many other areas of East Asia as well. And the other main group that you're probably more familiar with is from Central America, places like Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and the Caribbean included there as well. So we're seeing a lot of a large-scale immigrant population from these particular areas. And we see that quota policy that we talked about in the third wave really grow in this fourth wave. And they start realizing that, hey, we need to start setting specific numbers for different areas around the world. And so what they decided to do is that since we have these two areas, one from Asia and one from closer by in Central America, that we'll set a policy where we can have a certain amount from the Western Hemisphere and a certain amount from the Eastern Hemisphere. And that's what you start seeing here in the mid 20th century. Eventually today, what we're seeing now is more as a countrywide cap for each country. There's a certain amount of people that are allowed to immigrate from each country, and once you've hit that limit, that's it for that year. Um, we have a total worldwide limit, of course. We don't always hit that, and it's very selective who they allow to immigrate. A lot of times it's not enough just to apply for citizenship. There is a process that you have to go through, and you may or may not be selected. The United States has a very strict immigration policy, one of the strictest immigration policies in the world, and it's very tough. Oftentimes, it takes about 7 years to get full citizenship, and there's a lot of paperwork and hoops you got to jump through to get that. So that's kind of the 4 waves of migration that we see there. Again, let's go through it real quick. First wave, our colonial era, mostly Western Europeans and Africans coming through the slave trade. Second wave, 19th century. All right, we're seeing a large amount of Irish because of the potato famine and Chinese guest workers, and both of those groups are coming to work on the railroad and help with the gold rush, this land of economic opportunity. We're now seeing in the third wave, the late 19th, early 20th century, we're seeing mostly Eastern and Southern Europeans, mainly Italians, Russians, and many Jewish migrants coming into the country. And this is the first time that quotas were established. And finally, the fourth wave of migration in the United States, we're seeing now a shift from Europeans to more Central Americans, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and the Caribbean, as well as Asian Americans, particularly Vietnam, Philippines, and China are our main ones from that part of the world. And we've now, today, created caps for each country and how many people can come from each country with our quota laws. Okay. All right, so make sure you understand the push and pull factors for each wave and understanding where people came from and the different time periods for those 4 waves of our case study. So be able to apply those terms and laws of migration that we've talked about in previous sections and apply them to this last section.